Everyone, how we doing? Sorry about the delays getting started, but shouldn't be too big of a deal. Nothing too crazy today. We are talking about our specific natural resources, how they are managed, what we use them for, all that fun stuff. So the goal for today is for you to be able to tell me some of the value that forest resources have, either to the economy or to a ecological environment, and talk about some of the costs and benefits of actually harvesting forest resources, and be able to at least give me a general idea of the state of deforestation. So I know that sounds like a lot, but we got the rest of the week to talk about it. If at any point you think of a question that you might have for someone who works with this kind of stuff, be sure to jot it down because there is a place on Canvas for you to submit those. So, what resources do forests provide? So, as of right now, forests cover about 30% of the Earth's surface. That used to be much higher. Oh my goodness, no. They provide things like habitats for organisms. That's why deforestation takes such a big toll on biodiversity. Not only does tearing down a forest just kill the plant organisms that live in that area, but they also destroy the homes for a lot of other organisms. They play a key role in biogeochemical cycles. Those of you who were here last semester, we talked a lot about things like the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle and the water cycle, all of those things, how elements cycle through the atmosphere. For those of you who weren't here last semester, the main idea is that while energy flows in a one-way direction from the sun through other resources, nutrients move in cycles. So all of the carbon in the atmosphere can be taken up by different organisms and then go through a bunch of different processes that eventually lead it back into the atmosphere. Trees and forests in general play a big role in these. One of the biggest ways they do so is through photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is one of the few ways that we can get carbon out of the atmosphere, which is why as we tear down some of the natural forests that exist in the world, the amount of carbon in the atmosphere increases because it's not being stored in those organisms. They, on a more human-centric idea, forests give us wood for fuel, construction, so building things, paper, etc. All the things we talked about yesterday. Everything from the paper you're writing on to parts of the building we are sitting in. Lumber resources play a very, very large role. Resource managers who manage forests are called foresters, and they practice forestry. So forestry is the kind of field of work involving forest management. And that can be everything from how to properly harvest things to how to help forests recover, all that fun stuff. Anybody have any questions here? How are we doing? Okay. Ecological value is a really, really big deal whenever we talk about what a forest does for ecology. We have very, very complex habitats for plants and animals, lots and lots of biodiversity, and they prevent erosion, regulate the water cycle, reduce runoff. So this slide can be pretty much summed up in bullet points. So ecological value, they provide habitats. We have lots and lots and lots of biodiversity. We prevent erosion. Regulate the water and carbon cycle. Prevent flooding. And release oxygen. So when we're talking about an environment, or all of the ways that forests improve the ecological world, that is pretty much a big summation of it. When we talk about biodiversity, I say biodiversity a lot. If you're not super familiar with it, notebooks. Yeah. If you're not super familiar with it, it is just the amount of there's actually three types of biodiversity. There's genetic biodiversity, meaning we've got a bunch of different genes within a population. There is species diversity, which is the one I'm really talking about here, which means there's a bunch of different types of species, plant or animal. And then there's ecosystem diversity, which is like looking at the differences between ecosystems. So Indiana doesn't have a lot of ecosystem diversity, but if you look at California, right, Northern California has a bunch of different types of ecosystems than Southern California does. So ecosystem diversity would be higher over there. Rainforests, in particular, are the most biodiverse section of the earth. So, of all of the, if you took all of the different species that were on Earth, and you put it into a list, and then you took all of the ones that are only in rainforests, and you made another list, that list of rainforest species is bigger than all of the other biomes combined. So rainforests are a very, very, very large source of ecological value, not only for the amount of species that it holds, but also regulating the water and carbon cycle, and preventing flooding. If a forest or a big chunk of woods area is just clear cut and taken away, all those root systems die. Those root systems are really good at holding water. So if you live downhill from a forested area and that area is taken down, the amount of water and flooding that is released into an area could be a lot greater without that storage. So yeah, this is just a kind of diagram of the different layers of a forest. Up at the top, we've got our above canopy stuff. So that's our birds and other flying critters. Our canopy is just where all of the leafy stuff is. We've got more birds that live up there, along with all of like the climbing species. We've got the mid-story, which is other birds and tree-dwelling critters. The understory, which is right under where all of the leaves usually are. And finally, we've got our grounds. So we've got a bunch of different layers and different communities that live within those layers. This stuff's not super critical to our understanding, but it helps kind of understand how diverse that a forest can be. When we're talking about the economy, that's a whole different story. Forests our forests provide timber for all of our paper needs, but they also provide food and medicine. So fruits, nuts, herbs, spices all come from forest-dwelling plants. Chocolate is a big one. Cocoa beans aren't farmed in the typical way. A lot of spices and herbs and fruits aren't really good at being farmed. They're better to have found in their natural habitats, or something that closely resembles their natural habitats. Also, in not or in what's the word, developing nations, so poorer nations, a lot of individuals don't necessarily have access to things like grocery stores. So if they want these fruits, nuts, spices, and herbs, they actually have to go uh, find them. So not only does it allow us to harvest them and use them, but it allows people who live in these forested areas to actually sustain themselves. So we've also got a lot of resources for medicinal use. Um, a lot of less so now, but during the Industrial Revolution, when we started actually uh, discovering how the body works, so we can discover how to treat ailments instead of just giving somebody opium and telling them to go on their day, right? We actually figured out what the body was doing, so we actually figured out how to treat it, and we found a lot of different natural things that provide people with relief for whatever they are dealing with. Um, Comments, questions, concerns? I'm just gonna ask after every slide. Let's see. So, timber harvesting. There are two methods. All you need is like two methods and then these two definitions. So don't mess with writing this first paragraph. So just these two definitions down here. There are two different categories or two different methods to actually harvesting timber. One of them results in even aged trees, and one of them results in uneven aged trees. So, even aged trees result from regrowth that were mostly cut at the same time. So, if you took a forest, clear cut a bunch of trees in one area, and then replanted trees, those trees would grow at the same pace, ideally. So, whenever the forest was complete, all of the trees would be the same height at the same time. Uneven aged trees results from regrowth that from trees that were cut at different times. So if you go through and you cut every other tree and then you replant and you give those some time to grow and then you go through and cut what was left and replant and let those grow, we now have a couple different layers of tree growth, resulting in uneven aged trees. So if you can see this picture, we can see an even aged forest, which is just all of them the same size. And the uneven aged one, we've got a bunch of taller ones, some more medium sized ones, and some little baby ones. So these are the two main methods that timber companies can use to harvest trees, or at least the two main results from the methods that they use. Is that if I ever go too fast, just let me know. As we move forward, we're going to talk a little bit more about specifics when it comes to tree harvesting, the different ways that we can get these results, and the pros and cons of those different ways. So these are the three or four, there's four there if I could count. These are the four main timber harvesting strategies. So we will go through each one of them. The first one is clear cutting, which is probably the most self-explanatory, where you just go through and chop them all at the same time. That is a clear cutting harvesting strategy. We have seed tree harvesting strategies. We have shelter tree harvesting strategies, and these two are usually lumped together because they can be very, very similar. And then finally, we have selection systems, and there are a couple of different selection systems within that one category. So these are going to be the titles for the next couple slides. But these are the main ways, and there are pros and cons to all of them. Some of them are more focused on ecological value. Some of them are more focused on economical value. And then some of them that work better in some environments, but not so good in other environments. Starting with clear cutting, where we cut all the trees in one area at once. This is really cost efficient because it's faster, and you don't have, if you are renting equipment, you don't have to rent it in more than one go. If you are if it costs money to get out to the location and to transport the materials, it'd probably be cheaper to transport a lot at once rather than take a bunch of trips over the course of many years. It does have the biggest ecosystem impact of all of the ones we are going to talk about. Destroying the entire area, taking all of the trees out of it, is going to have the biggest effect on the individuals and the species that live there. And then finally, we've got microclimates. So when a microclimate is essentially the typical conditions in an area, but in a very, very small area. So forests have a really big impact on weather due to like the amount of water that they hold, the amount of humidity that they trap. They also have a really big impact on the amount of nutrients that are in the soil. So a lot of soil organisms, a lot of bacteria like to live on the roots of trees and plants. So if we clear cut a forest and all those roots die, so do all of the soil organisms that live there, which can change the amount of a certain nutrient that is in the soil. When we change these things, when we change a microclimate, it could change the ecosystem forever. If we lose all of our nitrogen fixing bacteria, the amount of nitrogen in the soil drops, and the plants that could once live there now cannot because there is not enough nitrogen for them to survive. So a new type of plant could move in that can survive in lower levels of nitrogen, but the ecosystem would be changed forever. If we change the soil composition or the weather enough, the original ecosystem that was torn down could never come back. We talked about succession, primary and secondary succession, which is how an ecosystem survives a disturbance. Primary succession is stuff like a hurricane or a tsunami wiping everything out, or a volcano setting everything back to bare rock. Secondary succession is these big disturbances like tornadoes and deforestation. Any questions about clear cutting? The next one are seed tree and shelter tree approaches. So in a seed tree approach, they leave a couple mature and healthy trees that produce seeds. That way they don't have to plant the new trees. They leave these trees available and they will produce the seeds that would eventually regrow the forest. That way they don't have to worry about replanting if they leave a tree that will do the replanting for them and just let nature take its course. Shelter tree or shelter wood approaches is essentially the same thing. We leave a small number of mature trees and they provide shelter for seedlings as they grow. So we might do the planting, but the seedlings have a better chance of surviving if there's a big tree to protect them from things like rain. because if it rains too much, the soil loosens up too much, or the seedlings get physically damaged by the rain in any way, shape, or form. It would take way, way longer and way more interference in order to help the forest to regrow. So if we leave these shelter trees in place, then we don't have as big of issues as we would have if there was nothing around. Very, very similar. One is a little bit more involved than the other because we do a lot more of the planting in the shelter tree approaches, whereas the seed tree approaches, we just kind of let them live. With um, if you've ever been driving down the road and you look out into a wooded area and it looks like all of the trees are perfectly aligned straight in a row, it was gives me vertigo if I look too close at them as I'm driving by or riding by. But those are typically like man-made planted forests to kind of help an area respond to clear cutting. They don't really involve shelter trees or seed trees. But you could tell the difference between a shelter wood approach and a seed tree approach because the shelter tree approach has more like man-made planted patterns than a seed tree approach, which just happens naturally. The a little bit more time, sorry. The final approach is a selection system. So, in a selection system, only some of the trees are harvested at once. So, this one is a little less cost efficient because we actually have to go back and do stuff a couple times. And there's long time gaps between harvests. But we're leaving trees behind. So, in a single tree selection system, people will go through, usually with a can of spray paint, and just mark the trees that are meant to be cut. If you're ever out on a hike and you see a tree that is marked, depending on the color that it is marked, it is either marked for save this because this tree is important, or marked because that tree is meant to fall down. And then we have group selection, where small patches of trees are cut. So instead of just going through and randomly picking them out, we've got groups, which is a lot easier to do. Single tree selection systems are probably the most difficult to carry out, money wise, time wise, manpower wise. But they are the least invasive when it comes to the ecosystem. So if we were to have images of this, I guess images of all of them, clear cutting looks a lot like this, where we've got just massive fields of nothing around. Seed tree and shelter wood approaches look a lot more like this, where we take most of the trees, but we leave some of the big, strong, sturdy ones to help the babies grow. Single tree selection systems is where we have just somebody going through and cutting selectively marked trees. And then group selection, if you can see right here, we've got a big forest, but little patches of it are taken out. We can run these on a scale of which ones are the, yeah, sure. This one. We can run these on a scale of which ones are better for the economy and which ones are better for the environment. So obviously, clear cutting would be the best for our pockets, but the worst for the individuals living in that area. And selection systems are great for the environment, but have a lot more, or require a lot more effort on our parts. So this middle ground, if a viable option, is our kind of happy medium. I'm not really sure off the top of my head how often each one of these happen, but I know that clear cutting was like the only option for a while, until we actually started recognizing that we were doing irreparable damage to the environment. And then we were able to like make the push and start spending the money that involves getting these other ones. So deforestation. Um, so deforestation is just the clearing of a forest and using that land for something else. Um, a lot of the times it is things like farmland or a city. So taking an existing forest, realizing that we need to start growing more food because we need food to feed people, or raise animals. We will people cut down forests and then use that land for other reasons. This is a very very big problem in developing nations, because developing nations are just trying to get as much money as they physically can as fast as they can, to kind of catch up to the rest of the world, um, and help their people, but they don't necessarily have the luxury of thinking about how their actions will affect the environment long term. In the US, usually deforestation goes more towards the urbanization side of things, where a city is on the edge of a forest, city expands, forest goes bye bye, stuff like that. That's supposed to be it instead of an if. Sorry, my brain short circuited. So while deforestation has allowed us to keep warm, keep sheltered, and allowed a lot of trade to happen, it's caused a lot of soil degradation and species population decline. So usually, if you look at the endangered species list, they are a lot of the animals that were displaced through deforestation. Um, the tropics, so whew, goodness gracious, around the equators, those regions are hit the hardest, because we've lost a heck of a lot of biodiversity. When we talk about rainforest deforestation, that's where it is. Um, we've lost biodiversity, we've lost soil productivity, and we've added more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Without these trees, so living things are made of carbon. Everything that is living on Earth is a carbon-based life form. So when we have forests and these massive, massive living things, they hold a lot of carbon in them. But as we tear trees down, as trees stop photosynthesizing, as we burn them, um, we release more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and there's nothing in the environment to hold it and trap it. So soil productivity is another big deal. Like I said, without the bacteria to hold on to the roots of the cell of the tree, sorry, we lose a lot of the nutrients that were in the soil, which is why when people do wind up deforesting for farmland, unless they practice really, really good farming strategies, which we'll talk about later this semester, they can lose the productivity of the soil altogether and just turn it into a desert, and it all was for naught. Um, that's deforestation. Worldwide, more specifically, looking in our backyards, um, deforestation for timber and farmland allowed us to expand across the continent. So in 1620, all of the black portions of this map, all of that was forest. So when colonizers first got here, this is what what our forests look like. In 1850, colonization continued to happen. And you can see that it started on the coasts and started to work inwards. In the 1920s, the Midwest and the East Coast are almost completely clear cut. But the West Coast was a lot safer. And then finally, if we're looking at 1990, we've just got little bits here and there, and you can thank the National Park Service for that. Without the National Park Service, likely this would be gone as well. Specifically, we've lost old growth forests. Old growth forests have never been logged in the history of like recorded time, or like recorded human interactions on this in this continent. When you think of old growth forests, think of like Redwood National Park, the giant trees on the West Coast. Those are what we have lost. We have no idea the amount of wood that was lost from these forests and how these hundreds of year old trees that would be standing are no longer standing. So in the US, we've got probably the biggest mass deforestation compared to other continents. Europe's up there too. In developing nations, like I said, deforestation happens rapidly because they have a lot of old growth forests, and they have today's technology to tear down quicker. So when colonizers came through and deforested the old growth forests in the 1800s, it was a lot slower. But now, imagine if the colonizers had bulldozers and cranes. So it can happen a lot faster. Goodness gracious, what is that word supposed to be? Great? Yeah. So, being able to deforest old growth forests does help them develop faster, allows them to have more farmland, allows them to sell those resources and make money to feed and grow their nation. But we have lost a lot of biodiversity and perhaps even the species of things we've not known. Ask up, please. There you go. So, questions, comments, concerns? I know it's not the most cheery lesson of them all talking about deforestation, but there are people out there whose whole job is dedicated to helping these things recover and preserving what we have. So I'll leave this up. There's an exit ticket on Canvas for you to fill out. Just a couple questions about this stuff. If you haven't finished the resource management assignment from yesterday, I highly recommend that you use this time to do that as well. We're still in the first week. If we can stay on top of it this week, then we won't have to worry about missing assignments later. So use this time to fill out that exit ticket. I can print it out for you. And then, oh, awesome. Perfect. So if you need help navigating the Canvas, let me know. So yeah, do that exit ticket. And if you haven't finished the assignment from yesterday, use this time to do that as well. Tomorrow, we talk a little bit more about the management of these things rather than the destruction of these things. Oh, perfect. Thank you so much.